Watching The Emperor Visits the Hell, a film I, in all honesty, didn't quite enjoy, something caught my attention. In one of the earlier scenes, something passes by, and it's a very short moment. I'll let you watch it. It's a storybook. A very close-up image of a storybook, but identifiable nonetheless. And as an avid reader, this got me intrigued. It was such a small part of the film, yet something about it really attracted me and drove me to dig deeper into this topic. It was then that I discovered Chinese, and excuse my pronunciation,
Lian Huan,
or by its direct translation, linked serial books. They also go by pulp comics, which is what I'll be referring to them as for the sake of my pronunciation and your ears. Now, I feel like when you think of Chinese comic books, your first thought is of the Chinese manhwa, not to be confused with the Korean manhwa. And these manhwas, with their covers of these beautiful characters and this gorgeous traditional watercolor styled art, these were inspired by Japanese mangas. Pulp comics, however, were small black and white paperbacks that differed greatly from the stylized iconography of modern Chinese manhwas. While most of the comics in China published today are manhwas, it was quite different in the 20th century. The pulp comics that can be found today were probably printed in the late 70s and 80s, but they were around for quite a while before this. While it's said that the origins of these pulp comics can be a bit hard to trace, scholars state that the LHH industry began in Shanghai during the 1920s and 30s. Some also attribute it down to three things: the traditional drawings in Chinese classical literature, Song Dynasty scrolls, and Chinese New Year's pictures. For example, a lot of romance novels often had pictures to accompany the stories told in them, such as Romance of Three Kingdoms, The Dream of the Red Chamber, or The Romance of the Western Chamber. In the early days of these pulp comics, they were mainly portrayed as adaptations of Jingzhi, Peking opera, and other Chinese literary classics. Stylistically, these portrayals were mainly done in line drawings, sketches, or oil wash paintings. And in the early days of these comics, they were often published as multi-volume adaptations of folktales like Journey to the West, which is precisely what we see in The Emperor Who Returned from Hell. And most of these comics weren't original stories, and this focus on adaptation would become a signature of the form of these pulp comics. They really started to rise in popularity after the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. This was because they were used as a way to popularize new government policies and regulations, which kind of reminds me of the propaganda art that the US spread widely during the wars in the 1900s. And from 1951 to 1956, more than 10,000 titles and 26 billion copies were published in China. And while the popularity of them did start to diminish at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution in 1966, it was quickly revived in the early 1970s through these heroic tales of when they were used during propaganda times. From the late 1970s to the mid-80s, they were then often used as a pretty important source of education and entertainment, and continued to be reading materials into the 90s before eventually losing its appeal. Today, they stand as hot collectible items, kind of like how Pokemon cards or vinyls are in the US now. Now, to talk more about the artistic style of these comics, they were usually very bold in style, featuring very expressive drawings that are a signature of this medium. Though the style does differ depending on the artist, you can see a lot of Western influence in the visual tradition of this style, like perspective drawing and cross-hatching, and these drawings were typically done in pen, with only a few being painted by brush. And this is actually a bit different from the manhwas today, where they're often done in the style of traditional ink brush painting, because that's what's popular right now. Now, if we want to compare it to Western comic books or Japanese manga, then these pulp comics relied more on text and sequential art and lacked the conversational feel that these other forms of comics had early on. Not to mention the size of these comics were generally pretty small, usually no bigger than the palm of your hand, and images were usually oriented horizontally on every page with short text accompanied on the side of a panel. Though this wasn't the total standard, the umbrella term of LHH included a great amount of visual storytelling styles. What inspired me to make this video, though, was the idea of what's called photo novels, or pulp comics that featured film stills with captions that was a decent way of movie-going long before videotapes and VHSs arrived to China in the 90s. I don't think these were super common, but they were usually comprised of stills from Chinese and Soviet Russian films produced in the 50s. Now, since the popularity of linked picture books popped off after the Cultural Revolution following the Sino-Japanese War, political themes were a large focus of this medium. This was represented thoroughly in the characters that stood for bravery, loyalty, and strength, and they were often opposed to foreign enemies. There wasn't just this though, it was also a lot of inspiration taken from classical Chinese folk tales and other mythological stories. Now, the LHH did expand outside of China, with some of them having been released in multiple languages in order to reach an international audience and other ethnic minority groups. And this was mainly during the Maoist era, where the aim was to spread communist and revolutionary ideas to the non-Chinese world. And while not much is known of them today, I think the impact they had can't be understated, especially when you consider that a lot of China was illiterate during the time that this storytelling medium became popular. And so this was a way to increase literacy among the general public. Their impact was pretty big, so I find it interesting how it seems like not much is spoken of them today, but hopefully that's something that changes in the future.